Imagine um, a sprawling, magnificent, ancient architectural marvel.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, so let's say it's an incredible palace, or maybe a grand place of worship, and it has stood for well over 1,000 years. Its foundations go deep into the bedrock of history, and its walls are just covered and scribed with the accumulated wisdom of centuries.
Wow.
But, now it's the modern era, and the city around this ancient structure has completely transformed.
Right, like totally modernized overnight.
Exactly. There are skyscrapers of glass and steel, roaring highways, and just this relentless, deafening hum of modern industry pressing right up against those ancient stone walls.
So the people living inside this ancient structure, they're looking out the windows, they're feeling the walls actually shake from the traffic, and they're faced with this monumental existential choice about what to do with their home.
Yeah. Do they tear the whole ancient building down and replace it with a sleek, soulless glass tower just to match the neighbors?
Or do they obsessively restore every single original stone and just board up the windows to block out the noisy modern world outside?
Right. Or, and this is the hardest option, do they try something much more complicated? Do they gut the interior to install modern plumbing and electricity while desperately trying to preserve that sacred facade?
That is the ultimate question.
It really is. And today, for you listening, we are mapping out the intellectual battlefield of the Arab-Muslim world over the last 2 centuries. We are using a fascinating, honestly incredibly dense text to do this. It's an excerpt from Majid Fakhry's A History of Islamic Philosophy.
Specifically, we're looking at a chapter titled Contemporary Trends.
Yes, contemporary trends. So, okay, let's unpack this. What is the blueprint for today?
Well, we are going to trace the explosive collision between traditional Islamic thought and the Western Enlightenment.
The big one.
The big one, yeah. We will move through the initial shock of this encounter, the rise of secularism, the fierce pushback of fundamentalism, and then into this fascinating, really surprising adoption of existentialism, positivism, and Marxism by Arab intellectuals.
Marxism, wow.
Yeah, we'll get there. And then finally arriving at postmodernism. But before we begin, I do want to establish a vital ground rule for this deep dive.
Please do. I think it's important we set the stage for you guys listening.
Exactly. So because this source material covers highly charged political, social, and religious ideologies, I mean, we are spanning left-wing, right-wing, secular, and fundamentalist perspectives here.
Covering all the bases.
Right. So our approach today is entirely analytical. This deep dive will strictly and impartially report on the contents of Fakhry's text. We are not here to take any sides, we will not endorse any viewpoints, and we are not validating any of these ideologies.
We are just the messengers.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We are simply here to convey and explain the ideas contained in the original source material. Nothing more.
I like to think of us as the tour guides in the Museum of Ideas. We didn't paint the paintings. We were just pointing out the brushstrokes so you can see them clearly.
That's a great way to put it.
So let's start the tour. We are in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Arab world is making profound contact with the European Enlightenment.
Which is a massive culture shock.
Huge. It sparks this profound identity crisis and a massive wave of liberal thought. And our first major character in this drama is a man named Rifa al-Tatawi.
Right, so al-Tatawi travels to Paris in 1826.
Okay.
He goes as an advisor to an Egyptian military mission, and he ends up staying there for 5 years.
5 years in Paris in the 1820s.
Exactly, and this is a crucial period. France is in the aftermath of the Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Paris is just this bubbling cauldron of new political and social theories.
So he's right in the thick of it.
He is. Al-Tatawi essentially absorbs the French Enlightenment like a sponge. He learns French, he immerses himself in the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu.
Wait, I have to ask. What does a 19th century Egyptian religious scholar do with Rousseau and Voltaire? I mean, those thinkers were actively tearing down the traditional authority of the church in Europe.
It's wild, right? He actually translates them.
Wow.
Or at least he supervises their translation into Arabic. He even translates the French Constitution.
You're kidding.
No, he really did. He writes a book summarizing his observations of Paris, and he highly praises the social virtues of the French. He admires their patriotism, their relentless work ethic, and their economic skills.
He's taking notes on everything.
He even commends their theater, not just as, entertainment, but as a vital form of public education.
That's fascinating. But none of that is strictly political.
Right. But the spark that really lights the modernist fire is his observation of their political and legal system.
He's looking at the Napoleonic Code, presumably. a completely secular legal framework.
Yes, exactly. He notes with great interest that French laws are not drawn from a sacred scripture. They aren't based on a divine book.
Yeah.
Instead, he observes that they are based on rational principles explicitly designed for public welfare, justice, and the prosperity of the realm.
So it's totally pragmatic.
Completely. He is looking at a society governed by human reason, aimed at practical, earthly flourishing rather than divine revelation.
I have to imagine that for you as a listener, putting yourself in his shoes, observing a society thriving on a completely non-religious legal code would create a massive paradigm shift, especially for someone coming from a society where jurisprudence and theology are just so tightly interwoven.
It's the ultimate culture shock, and it creates the foundational question for everything that follows in this text. Can you adopt the mechanics of a successful modern society without adopting its secular soul?
Can you just take the engine and leave the rest of the car?
Exactly. And this question gets pushed to its absolute limit in the 20th century by a literary giant named Taha Husayn.
Okay, tell me about Taha Husayn.
So Husayn trained at Al-Azhar, which is the absolute epicenter of traditional Islamic learning in Egypt, but he also studied in France.
The classic dual education.
Right. And in 1926, he publishes a treatise on pre-Islamic poetry that drops a revolutionary bombshell.
Wait, a treatise on poetry? That doesn't really sound like a bombshell. Why was that so explosive?
It sounds dry, I know.
I know.
But it's explosive because he applied modern philological criticism, meaning Western linguistic and historical analysis, to ancient Arabic texts.
Okay.
He questioned the actual historical authenticity of pre-Islamic poetry.
I'm still trying to see why the average person would care if a poem from the 6th century was misattributed. Like, so what?
Because pre-Islamic poetry isn't just art. It is the linguistic baseline used to understand and interpret the Arabic of the Quran itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If you destabilize the historical authenticity of that poetry, you begin to destabilize the orthodox understanding of the sacred text.
It's pulling a thread on a very big sweater.
Exactly. And Husayn didn't stop at poetry. He went so far as to question the historical authenticity of certain propositions in the Quran itself, using these Western academic methods to cast doubt on the historical existence of figures like Abraham and Ishmael.
Okay. In 1926 Egypt, questioning the literal historical truth of the Quran using Western academic tools, that is painting a giant target on your own back.
It was incredibly dangerous. It really was. And yet he doubled down.
He went further.
Oh, yeah. In 1938, Husayn published a book called The Future of Culture in Egypt, and he put forward a radical reevaluation of Egyptian identity itself.
What did he claim?
He argued that historically, Egypt's deepest and most permanent cultural ties were not with the East, not with Persia or the Arabian Peninsula,
Then who were they with?
with Greece and the Mediterranean. He claimed that the Egyptian mind is inherently Western.
Wait, he's looking at the map and saying, you know, we aren't an Eastern culture that got touched by the West. We are a Western culture that just happens to be located in the Middle East.
That is exactly what he's saying. He argued that even the advent of Islam in the 7th century didn't change the fundamentally Western character of Egyptian culture, just like the advent of Christianity didn't change the fundamental nature of Europe.
Because both absorbed Greek philosophy.
Yes. Islam actively absorbed Greek philosophy, which became an essential ingredient in Arab Islamic culture. Because of this, Husayn claimed that Egypt must follow the European path entirely. He literally wrote that Egyptians must participate in European civilization, embracing, and this is a quote, its good or evil, its sweetness or bitterness.
Its sweetness or bitterness. I am trying to understand how a devout society just wholesale adopts European civilization, which by the 1930s is aggressively secular and, rapidly industrializing. How does he propose they handle the obvious religious friction there?
He proposes a strict separation of the spiritual and the temporal. Husayn argued that Europe's success was due to separating religion from the state.
Ah, there it is, the secular divide.
Exactly. By adopting this separation, Egyptians could adopt all the basic components of Western civilization, the science, the democracy, the material progress, without losing their personal religion.
So it becomes a private matter.
Right. Religion, for Husayn, is meant to give emotional comfort to the hearts of men. He argued it shouldn't impinge on the rational, political, or cultural aspirations of the nation.
Okay, I think I have an analogy for this. It's like a country's culture and political system are the hardware, right? And religion is just one piece of software running on it.
I like where you're going with this.
So Hussein is suggesting you can upgrade the hardware to the newest European model. You get the better processing speed, the democratic institutions, the scientific method, without having to delete the spiritual software. The software just runs in the background in the privacy of your own home while the hardware runs the public sphere.
That's a perfect way to conceptualize it. He is attempting to completely compartmentalize faith. But, as you can imagine, the traditional clergy, the ulama, saw this proposition as an existential threat.
I'm sure they didn't just sit back and let religion be put in a box in the corner.
Not at all. In traditional Islamic theology, Islam is all-encompassing. The spiritual and the temporal, using your analogy, the hardware and the software, they are a single, inseparable, divine system. You cannot compartmentalize God's law into just the private sphere.
Right, they see the hardware and software as fused together.
Because of his views, Hussein was actually accused of apostasy. The traditionalists viewed this liberal separation not as a path to progress, but as a direct assault on the integrity of the faith itself.
Wow.
But the modernist shock had already set in, and other thinkers began trying to diagnose exactly why the Arab world was struggling to modernize. Which brings us to M. Abid al-Jabiri.
Okay, who is he?
He's a Moroccan intellectual, and he takes a structural, almost psychological approach to the problem.
So what was his diagnosis? What's wrong with the patient?
He argued that Arabic thought is fundamentally discontinuous and stuck in the past. His main critique was that Arab thinkers were constantly trying to use ancient Greek epistemological tools to solve modern ideological problems.
Using old tools for new problems.
Exactly. He diagnosed what he called the Arab mind with 3 specific cultural diseases. And these are very reminiscent of Francis Bacon's Idols of the Mind, if you're familiar with that.
Okay, what are the 3 diseases?
The 3 diseases are verbalism, a blind reverence for authority, and the belief in contingency.
Okay, verbalism and reverence for authority seem fairly straightforward. A culture obsessed with rhetoric and, deferring to elders or ancient texts. But belief in contingency. That sounds like a really dry academic term. What does that actually mean on a practical level?
It sounds abstract, but it has massive real-world implications. It actually stems from the Asharite school of theology, which dominated Sunni Islam for centuries.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the Asharites were deeply concerned with protecting the absolute, unfettered omnipotence of God.
Makes sense for a theology.
Right, but to do this, to make God truly all-powerful at every moment, they basically repudiated the idea of necessary cause and effect in the natural world.
Wait, I'm sorry. They repudiated cause and effect. Like if I drop a pen, it falls to the ground. That's gravity. How do you repudiate gravity?
Okay, so an Asharite would argue that the pen doesn't fall because of an inherent law of gravity. It falls because God actively wills the pen to move downward at that exact specific millisecond.
You're blowing my mind right now.
It is a completely atomistic view of time and matter. Here's another example. Fire doesn't burn cotton because fire has a natural inherent property of burning. It burns because God creates the burning sensation in the cotton at the exact moment the fire touches it.
So wait, if God wanted to, he could make the fire freeze the cotton instead.
Exactly.
So every single interaction in the universe is a direct, active miracle.
Yes. But al-Jabiri points out the devastating practical consequence of this theology. If you believe the universe operates on constant, unpredictable, divine whim rather than stable, discoverable, inherent laws of cause and effect, how can you ever build a modern scientific society?
Wow, you can't.
Right. How can you have physics, engineering, or medicine if you don't fundamentally believe in reliable natural causation?
Because if the laws of physics are just habits of God that he might change tomorrow, there's no point in building a science lab. You're just measuring what God decided to do today.
Exactly why al-Jabiri calls for a complete epistemological break with this traditional structure. He argues they should revive the rationalist, liberal spirit of Ibn Rushd.
Also known as Averroes in the West, right?
Yes, the 12th century Islamic philosopher who championed reason and natural law. Al-Jabiri believed that only by recapturing this Averroes spirit could they build a liberal, democratic, and secular Arab city based on reason.
This idea of a secular city brings us to the next major debate in the text. Hussein tried to split the spiritual and the temporal intellectually, like we talked about. But in 1924, history forced the issue violently in the real world with the abolition of the caliphate in Istanbul.
That event was massive. The abolition of the caliphate by the Turkish Grand National Assembly under Ataturk, it was a geopolitical and theological earthquake.
It's hard to overstate how big of a deal this was for the listener to grasp.
Oh, absolutely. For centuries, the caliphate had been the ultimate symbol of both the religious and political unity of the Muslim peoples. It was the physical embodiment of that inseparable system we just talked about.
The hardware and software running together.
Exactly. When it was dissolved, it forced a terrifying question. Can Islam exist purely as a religion, entirely separate from a state apparatus?
They suddenly had to figure out who gets the building and who gets the plumbing. So who stepped up to argue for secularism in the wake of this?
One of the first vocal defenders mentioned in the text is Farah Anton. He was a Christian rationalist who died shortly before the caliphate fell, actually in 1922.
Okay, what was his stance?
Anton argued that secularism, the complete separation of spiritual and temporal authority, was the absolute only way to guarantee tolerance, equality, and progress. He believed that without this separation, citizens of different faiths would never be equal under the law of a religious state.
That makes perfect sense coming from a Christian living as a minority in a majority Muslim region. He's looking out for civil rights and equal protection.
But he faced fierce opposition from Abdu, who was the Grand Mufti of Egypt.
The heavy hitter.
The heaviest. Abdu argued that you cannot apply Western Christian templates to Islam. Christianity might say, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's.
Right.
But Islam, Abdu argued, subordinates Caesar entirely to God. A ruler in Islam is totally accountable to divine law for all temporal deeds. There is no Caesar separate from God.
A Christian arguing for a secular state and the Grand Mufti rejecting it is a debate you could frankly predict. But the text highlights another thinker who makes the argument for secularism from inside the Islamic establishment, which is much more surprising to me.
You're referring to Ali al-Raziq. He was an Azarite scholar who published a revolutionary treatise in 1925, right after the caliphate was abolished.
A scholar from Al-Azhar arguing for secularism.
Yes. He re-examined the theological grounds of the Islamic theocratic state and argued that the caliphate, as a political institution, has absolutely no genuine basis in the Quran or in the traditions of the Prophet.
I am genuinely lost here. How does a scholar from the highest seat of Islamic learning argue that the Islamic State has no basis in Islam? Didn't the Prophet Muhammad literally run a political state and command an army in Medina?
He did, and al-Raziq had to address that directly.
How do you talk your way around that?
Al-Raziq made a very subtle but crucial theological distinction. He argued that the Prophet's political and military rule in Medina was born out of pure expediency.
Expediency?
Yes, it was a practical necessity for the survival of the early vulnerable community. However, he argued this political role was not an essential part of his prophetic message or his risalah.
So, Muhammad the Prophet and Muhammad the head of state were two different hats, and only one of them was divine.
That is exactly al-Raziq's argument. Islam is a religious call addressed to all mankind. It is not a blueprint for a universal political government. He quoted a tradition where the Prophet told his followers regarding agricultural techniques, "You are the best judges of your worldly affairs."
Oh, wow.
Al-Raziq used this quote to argue that God deliberately left worldly, political, and administrative matters to human discretion and human reason.
That is incredible theological judo right there. He uses the religious text to authorize secular innovation. It's like finding a loophole in the source code that allows you to install a completely new operating system. And another thinker, Muhammad Said al-Ashmawi, takes this textual analysis even further, right? He basically takes the traditionalists to court over the dictionary.
Yes, al-Ashmawi, who was himself a judge, published a book in 1987 called Political Islam, and he engaged in this fascinating etymological inquiry into the Quranic word hukum.
Okay.
Traditionalists who argue for a theocratic state almost always point to verses containing the word hukum, translating it to mean government or political rule. They use it to claim the Quran demands a specific Islamic political structure.
So what did al-Ashmawi find when he dug into the word?
He analyzed how the word was actually used in the 7th century context of the Quran, and he proved that it did not mean political government at all.
What did it mean?
It meant adjudication, arbitration, or wisdom. When the Quran says to judge rightly, it means to arbitrate personal disputes fairly, not to establish a political regime or a state apparatus.
This is exactly like a modern Supreme Court case for you legal buffs out there, where the entire verdict hinges on the dictionary definition of a single word from a document written hundreds of years ago. It's pure textual originalism. But he backs up his linguistics with hard statistics, doesn't he?
The statistics are, honestly, a devastating part of his argument. Al-Ashmawi points out that the Quran contains roughly 6,000 verses. Out of those 6,000, only about 700 deal with practical matters of exchange or worship. And out of those, only about 200 deal with matters of personal status, inheritance, or crime.
200 out of 6,000.
Right. And furthermore, there are only 4 specific types of penal sanctions mentioned in the entire text.
4 penal sanctions out of an entire society's potential criminal activities. How do you build an entire legal system out of just 4 sanctions and 200 verses?
Well, al-Ashmawi argues that you can't. He says this extreme dearth of legal prescription proves the Quran was never intended to be a comprehensive political constitution or a complete civil penal code.
It's just not long enough.
Exactly. Its core is moral and spiritual, focused on mercy and righteousness. Therefore, the vast, elaborate system of Sharia law that developed over the centuries was essentially created by humans through discretionary judgment. It is human legislation, built to fill the gaps, not direct divine decree.
If the text is statistically mostly spiritual and barely legal, and if the vocabulary doesn't even support the concept of a political state, how did the fundamentalists counter this incredibly specific mathematical and linguistic breakdown? I mean, you can't just ignore the math.
The fundamentalists do not fight back by nitpicking the etymology or arguing the statistics. They fight back with a sweeping, all-encompassing, visionary worldview.
They changed the game entirely.
Yes. They completely reject the secularist premise that human logic or human statistics can divide God's realm into percentages. For them, if God is sovereign, he is sovereign over 100% of existence, whether the Quran gives specific legal statutes for every micro-situation or not.
So the silence of the text doesn't mean secular freedom.
Exactly. The lack of specific verses just means humans are supposed to apply the general divine principles to everything, not carve out a secular space where God's law doesn't apply.
Because the secularists attempted to carve out a non-religious sphere of life, the fundamentalists reacted by asserting that absolutely every sphere of life belongs exclusively to God. And the most famous voice of this movement in the text is Sayyid Qutb. I really want to understand the psychological profile of a thinker like Qutb. What was he looking at in the mid-20th century that made him so disillusioned?
So Qutb was an Egyptian scholar who traveled to the United States in the late 1940s.
Oh, he actually came to the U.S.
He did, and he returned deeply, deeply repulsed by what he saw. He looked at Western civilization and concluded that it was spiritually bankrupt and had completely dehumanized mankind.
Really? Just from a visit?
Yes. He argued that the West had mastered material creativity, science, industry, economics, but had lost its soul in the process. It had become a machine that grinds up human beings.
Did he see any political system in the West that could save humanity? Like democracy or maybe socialism?
He claimed both had utterly failed. He argued Western democracy had degenerated into a capitalist free-for-all that just exploited the weak.
And socialism.
He viewed socialism and Marxism as ideologies that fundamentally conflict with human nature. He pointed out that they only seem to survive when enforced by brutal dictatorships.
Fair point, given the Soviet Union at the time.
Right. Therefore, Qutb argued, Islam must step in to rescue mankind, not to teach the West about science or material progress, which they obviously already had, but to provide a spiritual methodology that the modern world desperately lacked.
He used some very powerful polarizing terms to build his argument. Hakimiyya and Jahiliyya. Let's unpack those because they seem central to his whole philosophy.
They are absolutely central. Hakimiyya refers to the exclusive sovereignty and governance of God. Qutb argued that any system where humans legislate for other humans without recognizing God as the ultimate sovereign is a system where men worship each other.
Because you're submitting to a human's rule instead of God's.
Exactly. And that state of false worship, of submitting to human-made laws instead of divine laws, is what he called Jahiliyya.
Wait, Jahiliyya is a very specific historical term, isn't it? I thought it usually referred to the pagan times in Arabia before Islam existed.
Historically, yes, you're exactly right. It means the state of pre-Islamic ignorance and barbarism. But Qutb did something radical here. He applied it to modern society.
Oh, wow.
He argued that the modern world, by adopting secularism and human-made laws, had slipped backward into a new global Jahiliyya.
That is a terrifying diagnosis.
Yeah.
He's looking at modern Muslims, people who pray and fast every day, and telling them they're actually living in an age of dark pagan ignorance because their government passes secular laws.
Yes, and he was heavily influenced by a Pakistani thinker named al-Maududi, who was incredibly systematic in his critique of the West. Al-Maududi diagnosed the West with three massive ills.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, secularism. Because secularism strips God of his role in managing human affairs, al-Maududi didn't just call it a mistake. He equated it to the actual worship of Satan.
Okay, secularism equals Satan worship. I follow the theological logic there, even if it's extreme. But what was his second ill?
Nationalism. He saw nationalism as a false idol, basically a sacred cult where the nation replaces God as the object of ultimate loyalty.
I have to stop you there. I get why he hated secularism, but nationalism. In the mid-20th century, anti-colonial thinkers almost universally loved nationalism. It was their primary weapon to get the British and the French out of their countries. Why would a fundamentalist attack the very tool being used to fight imperialism?
It's a great question, because nationalism relies on arbitrary geographic borders and tribal identities, right?
Yeah.
And that divides the universal community of believers, the Ummah. For al-Maududi, dividing humanity by race or geography is a Western sickness.
Ah, I see. It splits up the faith.
Exactly. And his third ill was democracy.
He hated democracy, too.
Yes. While he acknowledged democracy started as a way to escape feudal tyranny, he argued it had become the tyranny of the majority. It falsely grants mere humans the absolute right to change laws at will, which usurps God's role as the sole lawgiver.
So his solution must be a total system reboot, like scrap the whole thing.
Pretty much. Al-Maududi's solution was total submission to God in all spheres of life. He advocated for human universalism to replace the tribalism of nationalism. And instead of viewing humans as sovereign citizens of a democracy, he argued man must be recognized solely as God's Khalifa or vicegerent, tasked with carrying out God's designs on earth.
You know, listening to Quat-Eve and al-Maududi's critique of the West, that it is a soulless, materialistic machine that strips humanity of its essence, that nationalism is an alienating trap, that capitalism is exploitative. It sounds shockingly similar to the critiques being written at the exact same time by Western existentialist and Marxist philosophers.
Like who?
Like Jean-Paul Sartre or Herbert Marcuse. I mean, they are all looking at the 20th century and saying, this system is completely dehumanizing.
You've hit on an observation that intellectual historians often point out. It's fascinating. The fundamentalists were thoroughly conditioned by the very contemporary Western crises they so vehemently opposed. They saw the same alienation, the same hollow consumerism, the same political tyranny that the Marxists and existentialists saw in Europe.
But they wrote completely different prescriptions for the disease.
Radically different. While a Marxist prescribed a workers' revolution to seize the means of production, and an existentialist prescribed finding your own authentic meaning in an absurd world, Quat-Dama believed the only cure was a return to absolute divine sovereignty.
Right.
And crucially, this wasn't just a philosophical stance, it was a call to action. Quat-Dama set the stage for jihad not just as internal spiritual struggle, but as forceful physical action to remove the systemic political obstacles standing in the way of this divine order.
While fundamentalists sought answers in a collective utopian return to God's law, the text shows us that other Arab intellectuals looked at the exact same modern alienation and ran in completely different directions.
Yeah.
Some turned deeply inward to the individual, which brings us to Arab existentialism.
Yes, existentialism found a highly receptive audience among thinkers trying to navigate this crisis of identity. The text highlights A.R. Badawi in Egypt, who deeply embraced the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. Specifically, Heidegger's concept of Dasein, or being in time.
Heidegger is famously dense. Being in time, Dasein. What does that actually mean for a thinker sitting in a cafe in Cairo in the 1950s?
It translates literally to being there. It's the idea that human beings are thrown into a world they didn't choose, and they have to grapple with their own inevitable death.
Cheerful.
Very. Badawi argued that humans must stop trying to escape into comforting illusions of eternity or religious utopias. We must accept our temporal, finite, fragile being. For Badawi, the deep anxiety we feel isn't a political problem to be solved by a new government. It is cosmic and inherent to existence itself.
That is a bleak philosophy for you to wake up to. Basically, you are here, you are going to die, and the anxiety you feel is just the price of admission. Deal with it.
Furthermore, Badawi adopted a strictly anti-metaphysical stance. He denied the validity of speculating about anything outside concrete human experience.
Meaning no speculating about traditional theology, the nature of God, or the afterlife.
Exactly. It's a complete break from traditional religious thought.
But not all the Arab existentialists were that aggressively anti-theological, were they?
No, thinkers like Rene Habachi and Abd al-Aziz al-Ababi offered a different flavor. It's often called personalist existentialism.
Personalist.
Yeah, and Lababi is particularly interesting because he directly criticized the absolute foundation of Western modern philosophy. He went right after René Descartes' famous declaration, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
Why go after Descartes? That statement is the bedrock of the Enlightenment. The idea that my ability to reason is the proof of my existence.
Because Lababi argued that Descartes' formula fundamentally isolates the self. It imagines a mind thinking in a vacuum, completely disconnected from reality.
Just a brain in a jar.
Right. Lababi argued that the self does not exist in isolation. It only truly manifests and actualizes through interaction with others and with society. If you cut yourself off from social intercourse to just, quote-unquote, think, you become a victim of introversion. Lababi called this isolation metaphysical dizziness.
Metaphysical dizziness. I like that. It feels very applicable to the modern digital age, actually. If you isolate yourself and just live in your own head or on your phone, you lose your grounding in reality.
Absolutely. For Lababi, existence means personal commitment and active engagement with the world. And for some personalists, it also meant engagement with a higher transcendent reality as well.
So we have the existentialists exploring the deep inner workings of the self. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have the positivists. They don't care about your cosmic anxiety or your metaphysical dizziness. They care about science, logic, and cold, hard, verifiable facts.
Yes. And the champion of this movement is an Egyptian philosopher named Zaki Naguib Mahmoud. Mahmoud launched what Fakhry describes as a devastating critique of Arabic thought.
How bad was it?
Well, if al-Jabiri diagnosed the Arab mind with diseases, Mahmoud diagnosed it with terminal irrelevance.
Ouch.
He argued that traditional Arabic culture was obsessed with authoritarianism, traditionalism, and most damningly, what he called verbalism.
Wait, al-Jabiri also talked about verbalism.
Yeah.
Is Mahmoud talking about the same thing here?
It's similar, but Mahmoud takes it much further. Mahmoud calls it the word industry. He compared traditional philosophers and theologians to spiders.
Cider.
Yeah, he said they spent centuries weaving endless, intricate cobwebs of commentaries and then super commentaries on those commentaries around what he called fake words.
Fake words. What makes a word a fake word?
To a logical positivist like Mahmoud, a word is fake if it doesn't refer to a physical sensory reality that can be scientifically verified. So, words like essence, substance, soul, or the unmoved mover, these are all fake words to Mahmoud.
Because you can't measure a soul in a beaker.
Exactly. They have no basis in empirical science.
Mahmoud is basically calling out the ultimate echo chamber. It sounds like he's saying traditional Arab philosophy became the equivalent of modern social media hot takes. Just endless words reacting to other words, commenting on commentaries, producing absolutely nothing tangible for society. It's an intellectual hamster wheel.
That's a brutal but accurate comparison. Mahmoud believed that the veneration of the Arabic language had become a pathology. The language was worshipped as a sacred object in itself, rather than used as a practical tool for communication or science.
So it's his fix.
His prescription was incredibly harsh. He said the Arab world must entirely abandon this useless word industry. To survive and progress, they must transition to a productive industry based entirely on science, technology, and the productive machine. No more theological cobwebs, only concrete, measurable results.
But throwing away centuries of literary, poetic, and philosophical heritage? Is he seriously suggesting they just dump all of that in the trash? I mean, I can't imagine people just willingly tossing out their entire intellectual history because a positivist told them to go build a steam engine.
You're right, and they didn't. Mahmoud's hyperlogical, machine-focused solution was simply too sterile for many intellectuals. It felt like cultural self-amputation. It left a massive vacuum regarding how to deal with the Turath, the rich, sprawling Arab cultural heritage. You can't just delete 1,000 years of history. And this desperate need to keep the heritage, but radically modernize the society, is exactly the space that the Arab Marxists aggressively stepped into.
Okay, this is the part I've been waiting for. If positivists like Mahmoud wanted to throw the past in the trash to build a scientific future, Arab Marxists wanted to keep the past, but run it through a radical materialist translation machine. But why Marxism? Why would Arab intellectuals in the 20th century turn to a philosophy written by a German economist?
It seems strange at first, but to understand why Marxism was so appealing, we have to look at a thinker named Abdallah Laroui. He framed Marxism not just as an economic system, but as a psychological lifeline.
A lifeline for who?
For the Arab intellectual, Laroui highlighted what he called the tragedy of the Arab intellectual. These thinkers were caught in a brutal cognitive dissonance.
How so?
Well, on one hand, they knew their societies desperately needed modernity, science, and rationalism, all of which were currently associated with the West. On the other hand, they fiercely refused to surrender to Western capitalist imperialism, which was actively colonizing, bombing, and exploiting them.
You hate the oppressor, but you realize you need the oppressor's tools to survive. That is a terrible psychological bind to be in.
Leroux explains that Marxism offered the perfect escape hatch. Marxism is a Western, highly rational, universal, and scientific system, so it checks the box for modernity.
Right.
But simultaneously, Marxism's entire purpose is to ruthlessly attack and dismantle Western capitalist imperialism. By adopting Marxism, the Arab intellectual could be modern and violently anti-imperialist at the exact same time. It completely resolved their cognitive dissonance.
Oh, I see it now. It's a tool that lets you fight the master with a different set of the master's tools. I totally get the political utility. But Marxism is famously atheist and materialist. Religion is the opiate of the masses, right? How do you sell a purely materialist philosophy to a culture deeply rooted in Islamic theology? You can't just ignore the Turath, the heritage.
You don't ignore it, you rebrand it. And this is where thinkers like Tayyib Tuzaini and Hussein Murwa did some astonishing intellectual gymnastics.
What did it do?
They applied Marxist historical materialism to medieval Islamic philosophy. They went back to the revered giants of Islamic thought men like al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, and argued that these men were not really orthodox religious thinkers at all.
What were they then?
They argued they were actually early materialists.
I am genuinely stuck on this. You're telling me they took medieval Islamic judges and theologians who spent their lives arguing over Aristotle and the Quran and just slapped a Marxist label on them? How did anyone take that seriously? It sounds like historical revisionism on steroids. It's like trying to claim William Shakespeare was secretly a 21st century tech bro because he wrote a play about human ambition. How on earth did they justify this?
It sounds crazy, but they had a method. They looked for specific metaphysical debates in the medieval era that mirrored materialist concerns. For instance, they focused heavily on the intense medieval debate over creation.
Creation, like how the world started.
Exactly. Orthodox Islamic theology insists on creation ex nihilo, that God created the universe out of absolute nothingness at a specific moment in time. But philosophers like Ibn Rushd, following Aristotle, argued for the eternity of the world, meaning matter has always existed.
Okay, but why does the age of matter prove someone is a Marxist?
Tuzaini and Murwa argued that if these ancient philosophers believed matter was eternal, they were essentially denying the need for a divine creator to pop things into existence. If matter is eternal and governed by its own internal laws, then the universe is fundamentally material, not spiritual.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, they argued, these ancient philosophers were secret materialists and pantheists, hiding their radical proto-Marxist ideas under a thin veneer of religious language to avoid persecution from the Orthodox clergy.
So they basically retconned Islamic philosophy.
Yeah.
They went back and wrote a prequel where the heroes were secretly materialists all along.
Yes, and they went even further than just philosophy. They rebranded history itself.
Now,
Murwa looked at ancient, violent political upheavals in Islamic history, such as the Zand Rebellion.
what was that?
The Zand Rebellion was a massive revolt by enslaved people of East African descent in southern Iraq in the 9th century. He also looked at the Qarmatian uprisings, which were famous for literally sacking Mecca. Traditionally, these were viewed by historians as religious schisms, heretical movements, or tribal conflicts.
But Murwa reads them differently.
He reframed them completely through the lens of historical materialism. He argued these weren't religious wars at all. They were classic Marxist class struggles.
No way.
Yes. It was the exploited workers, the enslaved, and the peasants rising up against the land-owning bourgeois aristocracy. The combatants just expressed their economic grievances in the religious vocabulary at the time because religion was the only language available to them.
It's fascinating how they project their current political needs backward. They aren't just doing history, they're actively trying to legitimize socialism in the Arab world. They're trying to prove that it isn't a foreign import from Karl Marx in Germany. They're saying, hey, this isn't alien to us. This class struggle and materialism has been in our Arab cultural DNA for 1,000 years.
It was a brilliant survival strategy for the ideology. It really anchored it locally. But eventually, this relentless desire to force history into predetermined grand narrative molds, whether that mold is fundamentalist, positivist, or Marxist, began to face its own intellectual backlash.
People got tired of it.
Thinkers grew exhausted by these totalizing systems that claimed to have the one objective truth of history. And that brings us to the final movement in the text.
Postmodernism and hermeneutics. We've gone through all these grand theories that try to find the objective truth of history or religion, but postmodernism flips the board over entirely. Postmodern thinkers stop trying to find objective historical truths and instead focus entirely on how texts, context, and power dynamics create meaning in the first place.
Exactly. And the text introduces us to Hassan Hanafi, an Egyptian philosopher who coined a fascinating discipline called Occidentalism.
Occidentalism. So to understand Occidentalism, I assume you first have to understand Orientalism, which is the long Western academic tradition of studying the East. Orientalism has often been criticized for patronizing, exoticizing, or essentializing the Arab world, basically treating it as a passive object to be examined under a Western microscope.
Right. Edward Said wrote the famous book on it. So Occidentalism is taking the microscope and turning it around.
Ah, I love that.
It is the East actively studying, critiquing, and deconstructing the West, asserting agency rather than just being studied. And regarding Islamic texts themselves, Hanafi promoted a hermeneutic reading of the Quran.
Remind us what hermeneutics is, just to be clear.
Hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of interpretation. Hanafi argued that the meaning of a sacred text isn't just floating inherently in the words frozen in time forever. Meaning is deeply, inextricably tied to the specific sociopolitical context of when it was written, and equally tied to the context of the person reading it today.
So you can't just read a verse regarding economics or gender from the 7th century and apply it blindly to the year 2026 without heavily translating the context. The text doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Which leads us to the final major thinker in our deep dive, and perhaps one of the most provocative, Mohamed Arkoun. He took French postmodernist theory thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and aimed it directly at Islamic texts and history.
Arkoun was ruthless in his critique of traditional methodology. He fiercely attacked the orthodox idea that religious ideas or texts are stable consistencies.
Right, and what he meant by stable consistencies is the orthodox belief that sacred texts and theological doctrines are somehow immune to history. The traditional view treats them as if they float outside of time, completely unaffected by economics, politics, or human psychology.
Which a postmodernist would say is impossible.
Arkoun argued this is a myth, and he introduced a very powerful disruptive concept called the unthought.
The unthought. What exactly is that? It sounds ominous.
It refers to the specific subjects, ideas, and critical approaches within contemporary Islamic thought that are orthodoxly forbidden to be thought about. It is the vast intellectual territory that religious and political authority has deemed entirely off limits for questioning.
Wow.
Arkoun argued that the current crisis in the Arab Muslim world is fundamentally a clash between this authoritative power that enforces the boundaries of the unthought and the desperate modern need for critical, rational discourse.
It's like an invisible electric fence in the mind of a culture. Arkoun is pointing out that there are entire rooms in the House of Islamic Philosophy that have been padlocked for centuries, and everyone just agrees to politely pretend the doors aren't even there. And if you reach for the doorknob, you get shocked.
Arkoun didn't just point at the doors, he actively tried to pick the locks. He championed what he called a secular model of historical interpretation for the Quran. Instead of treating the text as an unquestioned, unhistorical absolute that just dropped out of the sky devoid of earthly context, he argued scholars must rigorously analyze the ecological, sociological, and fierce political context of Mecca and Medina during the Prophet's life.
You have to understand the messy human environment to truly understand the text it produced.
Exactly. But touching that electric fence, breaking into the unthought, has severe real-world consequences, doesn't it?
I assume it does.
It really does. Arkoun highlights the tragic case of scholars like Nasser Abu Zaid in Egypt in the 1990s. Abu Zaid attempted to do exactly what Arkoun suggested. He applied modern, standard literary criticism and linguistic analysis to the Quran. He treated it as a literary text to be analyzed from metaphor and historical context.
And what happened to him?
He was met with violent structural rejection. He was declared an apostate by Orthodox scholars.
Oh, no.
It gets worse. His marriage was forcibly annulled by an Egyptian court because, under their interpretation of the law, a Muslim woman cannot remain married to an apostate.
You've got to be kidding me. Over literary criticism.
Over literary criticism, he and his wife were eventually forced to flee into exile in Europe. For Arkoun, the tragedy of Abu Zaid is the ultimate heartbreaking proof of his concept. It proved exactly how violent, powerful, and dogmatic the enforcement of the unthinkable had become.
From Rifa al-Tatawi, reading Rousseau in Paris in the 1820s, dreaming of a rational society, to Nasser Abu Zaid, being forced into exile in the 1990s just for applying literary criticism to a text. What an immense journey.
It really is.
We have covered incredible intellectual terrain today. We've seen the Arab-Muslim world grapple with the shock of modernity and the quest for identity through a dizzying array of lenses. We explored the liberal awakening and the attempt to separate the hardware of the state from the software of religion.
We waded into the fierce legal, etymological, and mathematical battles over secularism.
We saw the totalizing, uncompromising, systemic vision of the fundamentalists who viewed the modern world as a new dark age. We felt the cosmic anxiety of the existentialists and the sterile, machine-like logic of the positivists.
We watched the Marxists retroactively draft medieval philosophers into a class struggle.
And finally, we saw the postmodernists trying to dismantle the invisible fences of the unthought. It is a vibrant, sometimes violent, but always continuing struggle over the soul, the state, and the sacred text.
It is a testament to the enduring power of ideas. These aren't just dry academic debates happening in ivory towers. These are philosophies that have shaped nations, sparked revolutions, drawn borders, and defined millions of lives.
And that brings us to the end of Fakhry's text. But I want to leave you, our listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over. It builds on a small but vital point Fakhry makes at the very conclusion of this chapter. He notes that all of these modern movements we just discussed, from the Khomeini movement in Iran to Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia to the secularists, the Marxists, and the postmodernists, they are all ultimately tied to a perennial, ongoing task of rational inquiry that was started by a man named al-Kindi, the very first Islamic philosopher, way back in the 9th century.
It all connects back.
It does. So here is the thought I want to leave you with. When you watch the news today and you see geopolitical clashes in the Middle East or fierce debates over Islamic law or protests in the streets, it is incredibly easy to think you're watching modern political and economic disputes about oil or borders or modern dictatorships. But what if you aren't? What if every headline you read today is actually just the latest bleeding-edge chapter in a 1,200-year-old philosophical debate started by al-Kindi about how to reconcile human reason and divine revelation? The actors have changed, the technology has changed, the buildings have been renovated 100 times over, but the philosophical script, that script is still being written.
The foundations remain, even as the city around it transforms.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.